Welcome to American Baller, where we focus on all things NFL. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos. Week 9 is officially in the books. This was another week of crazy plays and a handful of close matchups. Today, we're set to break down each matchup, highlight the players with the top performances from the week, and finally look at the MVP leaderboard. Houston Texans vs. New York Jets. The week kicked off with a Thursday night matchup between the Houston Texans and New York Jets. CJ Stroud had a very quiet performance, throwing for only 191 yards while only completing 36.7% of his passes. This was one of his worst showings of the year and a very out-of-character game from him. Joe Mixon continued to hold things down for Houston on the ground, picking up 106 yards and a touchdown. Aaron Rodgers led the Jets to a much-needed get-back game. He threw for 211 yards and 3 touchdowns. The wide receiver duo of Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson absolutely showed out, with Adams pulling in 7 passes for 91 yards and a touchdown, while Wilson recorded 9 receptions, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns. New York came out on top by a final score of 21-13. They now sit at 3-6, while the Texans are still in a solid spot with a record of 6-3. New Orleans Saints vs. Carolina Panthers. Starting off the 1 o'clock slate of games was the New Orleans Saints and Carolina Panthers in an NFC South showdown. Derek Carr made a return to action. While he had a solid game throwing for 236 yards and a touchdown, it was far from the stat sheet stuffing performance that many were expecting. Alvin Kamara was a bit of a one-man army for New Orleans' offense, leading the team on the ground with 155 yards and also receiving yards, pulling in 6 passes for 60 yards. The Saints suffered a huge loss at the wide receiver position, with Chris Olave suffering a concussion following a huge hit from Panthers defender Xavier Woods, who picked up an unnecessary roughness call for the play. Chuba Hubbard came up huge for the Panthers, picking up 72 yards and finding the end zone twice. Carolina came out on top in a tight 23-22 win. After this matchup, both teams now sit at 2-7 and are well on their way to fighting for a top spot in the 2025 NFL Draft. Washington Commanders vs. New York Giants. Up next, we'll take a look at an NFC East matchup between the Washington Commanders and New York Giants. This was another very close game, with the quarterbacks on both sides, Jaden Daniels and Daniel Jones, having very solid days. Daniels threw for 209 yards and 2 touchdowns, while Jones picked up 174 yards and 2 touchdowns of his own through the air, along with 54 yards and a score on the ground. Despite only making 2 catches for 19 yards, Commanders wide receiver Terry McLaurin found the end zone twice. This was a game that came down to the wire, with the Commanders winning by a final score of 27-22. Washington continues to prove itself as one of the top teams in the NFC, improving their record to 7-2, while the Giants fall to a rough 2-7. Miami Dolphins vs. Buffalo Bills. Now let's move on to an AFC East matchup between the Miami Dolphins and Buffalo Bills. This was a very close game, despite the two teams having very different seasons up to this point. Miami desperately needed a win this week, and Tua Tagovailoa had a very solid performance, throwing for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns while finishing the day with only 3 incomplete passes. Devon Achane was everywhere in this matchup for Miami, picking up 63 yards and a score on the ground, along with pulling in 8 passes for 58 yards and a touchdown. On the other side, Josh Allen continued to make his case for being the league's MVP, throwing for 235 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. While Miami put up a good fight, they didn't have enough to take down a juggernaut of a Bills team who came out on top by a final score of 30-27. Buffalo now sits at 7-2 and are one of the front runners in the AFC, while the Dolphins fall to 2-6 and are quickly running out of time to pull things together before their playoff hopes are completely squandered. Los Angeles Chargers vs. Cleveland Browns. Next up, we've got a matchup between the Los Angeles Chargers and Cleveland Browns. While Jameis Winston came up huge for Cleveland last week, leading the team in passing yards and delivering a game-winning touchdown against the Baltimore Ravens, he had an awful showing against Los Angeles. He finished the matchup with 235 yards, 1 touchdown, and 3 interceptions. Cleveland couldn't get anything going on offense, but the same couldn't be said for the Chargers. Justin Herbert finished the game with 282 yards and 2 touchdowns, while J.K. Dobbins had a strong day on the ground with 85 yards and a pair of touchdowns. This was an easy win for Los Angeles, coming out on top 27-10, improving their record to 5-3, while the Browns fell to 2-7. New England Patriots vs. Tennessee Titans. Now we'll take a look at a game between two of the worst teams this season in the New England Patriots and Tennessee Titans. While they both had very rough starts to the season, this was a very hard-fought game on both sides. The Patriots offense didn't show up today, with Drake May throwing for 206 yards, 1 touchdown and 2 picks. He also led the team in rushing yards with a 95 on only 8 carries. On the other side, Mason Rudolph showed up, recording 240 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Despite New England's rough day on offense, this was still a very tight game that went to overtime. The Titans came out on top by a final score of 20-17, improving their record to 2-6, while the Pats fell to 2-7. This could end up being a matchup that plays a major role on who gets the top pick in next year's draft. Dallas Cowboys vs. Atlanta Falcons. Up next, we've got a game between the Dallas Cowboys and Atlanta Falcons. Thus far, this has been a very rough year for the Cowboys. Despite this team having a very talented roster, they've not shown up to play this year. In this game, their offense suffered 2 massive blows, with both quarterback Dak Prescott and star wideout CeeDee Lamb being forced to exit the game with injuries. Prescott suffered a hamstring injury, while Lamb injured his shoulder, reportedly suffering a sprained AC joint. Kirk Cousins had another great game through the air, throwing for 222 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Falcons also suffered a hit to their roster, with Drake London being forced to exit the game with a hip injury. Atlanta came out with a 27-21 win, now sitting at 6-3, while the Cowboys are now at 3-5. Depending on how long Prescott and Lamb are sidelined, the Cowboy season could very well be over. Las Vegas Raiders vs. Cincinnati Bengals. Now we'll look at the game between the Las Vegas Raiders and Cincinnati Bengals. This matchup was an absolute blowout, and it appears that the Bengals could be back. While they took on a much inferior opponent in the Raiders, Joe Burrow had an elite showing through the air, throwing for 251 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Bengals running back Chase Brown also had a strong showing, picking up 120 yards on the ground along with pulling in 5 receptions for 37 yards and a score. Tight end Mike Gesicki led the team in receiving yards with 100 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 5 catches. No one for Las Vegas could really get much going on the offensive side of the ball, and Cincinnati won in dominant fashion by a final score of 41-24. The Bengals have begun the uphill battle of making it back into the playoff hunt, improving their record to 4-5, while the Raiders fall to 2-7. Denver Broncos vs. Baltimore Ravens. Up next, we've got another blowout on our hands, this time in a game between the Denver Broncos and the Baltimore Ravens. So far through the season, Denver has had one of the strongest defensive units in the entire league, but they didn't have what it took to slow down the Ravens even a little. Baltimore teed off on their defense with Lamar Jackson throwing for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns while completing 16 of his 19 passes. The main beneficiary of this elite day through the air was Zay Jones, who went for 127 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 5 receptions. Derrick Henry held things down on the ground for Baltimore, picking up 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. Courtland Sutton did what he could to keep the Broncos in the game, pulling in 7 passes for 122 yards and also throwing for a 2-yard touchdown. This was nowhere near enough, and the Ravens won by a final score of 41-10. Denver now sits at 5-4, while Baltimore now has a record of 6-3, continuing to prove themselves as a real contender in the AFC. Chicago Bears vs. Arizona Cardinals. Now let's move on to the 4 o'clock slate and start off with the Chicago Bears and Arizona Cardinals. The trend of blowouts continues in this matchup. Neither quarterback really showed up to play, with Caleb Williams struggling for 217 yards through the air. Along with this, he suffered a tweaked ankle that was clearly bothering him through the game. DeAndre Swift couldn't get much going on the ground for Chicago either, picking up only 51 yards on 16 carries. For Arizona, Kyler Murray had a rough day through the air, throwing for 154 yards, but was bailed out by backup running backs Amari DeMarcado and Trey Benson, who combined for 96 yards and a pair of touchdowns on the ground. Despite the lack of passing success for the Cardinals, they still won by a final score of 29-9. Arizona now sits at 5-4, while the Bears are now 4-4. Jacksonville Jaguars vs. Philadelphia Eagles. Up next, we'll take a look at the Jacksonville Jaguars and Philadelphia Eagles. This has been a very rough season so far for the Jags, and things didn't improve for them in Week 9. Trevor Lawrence had an awful day through the air, throwing for 169 yards and 2 picks, but he did find the end zone twice on the ground. For Philadelphia, Jalen Hurts had an incredible showing, throwing for 230 yards and a touchdown, along with picking up 67 yards and another score on the ground. Saquon Barkley completely showed out in this matchup, rushing for 159 yards and a touchdown and pulling in 3 passes for 40 yards and another score. To put the cherry on top, he may have made one of the best plays of the entire year, spinning out a Jags defender before pulling off potentially the first no-look hurdle in league history. While everything was clicking for Philly on offense, they did suffer a major loss, with A.J. Brown going down with a knee injury. Despite their lack of offensive success, the Jags kept this game competitive but ultimately came up short, losing 28-23. Philadelphia improves to 6-2 on the season, while Jacksonville falls to 2-7. Los Angeles Rams vs. Seattle Seahawks. Now we'll jump to one of the best games of the week, an NFC West showdown between the Los Angeles Rams and Seattle Seahawks. Both quarterbacks showed out in this game, with Matthew Stafford throwing for 298 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. Stafford was able to achieve this even without star wideout Puka Nacua being ejected right before halftime after throwing a punch. Geno Smith recorded 363 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 picks. Jackson Smith-Njigba was the main beneficiary of Smith's strong showing, finishing the game with 7 catches, 180 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The 3 picks went on to make a huge difference. This matchup went on to go into overtime, with the Rams coming out on top 26-20. Had Smith been able to have even one of these turnovers back, there's a strong chance that the game ended in Seattle's favor. LA now sits at 4-4, while the Seahawks fall below 500 with a record of 4-5. Detroit Lions vs. Green Bay Packers. Rounding out the 4 o'clock slate, we've got an NFC North matchup between the Detroit Lions and Green Bay Packers. These are 2 teams that are well on their way to qualifying for the postseason, and it was one of the most hyped up matchups coming into the week. This was a relatively quiet game offensively for both teams, with Jared Goff throwing for 145 yards and a touchdown, while Detroit's running back duo of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs combined for 138 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Jordan Love struggled through the air, finishing the contest with 273 yards and a pick. The Lions came out on top by a final score of 24-14, improving their record to 7-1, while the Packers fell to 6-3. Indianapolis Colts vs. Minnesota Vikings. In the Sunday night matchup, the Indianapolis Colts took on the Minnesota Vikings. While many expected Joe Flacco to have a similar effect on the Colts offense as he did for the Cleveland Browns last season, this was far from the case in Week 9. He finished the game with a measly 179 yards and a pick. Indianapolis's only touchdown of the game came on a recovered fumble. Things went much more smoothly through the air for the Vikings, with Sam Darnold torching Indy for 290 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 picks. These turnovers from the Vikings kept the game tight, but when the final whistle sounded, they took the game by a final score of 21-13, ending their 2-game losing skid and improving their record to 6-2, while the Colts fell to 4-5. Tampa Bay Buccaneers vs. Kansas City Chiefs. Rounding out Week 9, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took on the Kansas City Chiefs in a Monday night showdown. Once again, this was a very close game for the Chiefs. Both sides were clicking offensively, while the Buccaneers couldn't get much going on the ground. Baker Mayfield had a strong showing, throwing for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. But he was outclassed by Patrick Mahomes, who had one of his best showings of the year, throwing for 291 yards and 3 touchdowns. Kareem Hunt made his impact felt, rushing for 106 yards and a score, while Travis Kelce also played a major role, pulling in 14 passes for 100 yards. Tampa Bay was able to keep this game extremely close till the end, but ultimately fell in overtime by a final score of 30-24. The Bucs now sit at 4-5, while the Chiefs' hopes of a perfect season still remain alive and well, improving to an undefeated 8-0 record. Players of the Week. We saw some very strong performances in Week 9, but some stand out among the rest. Geno Smith led the league in passing yards this week in the Seahawks' 26-20 overtime loss to the Los Angeles Rams. Along with his 363 yards, he also threw for 3 touchdowns and 3 picks. Saquon Barkley had the highlight of the week with his no-look hurdle in the Eagles' 28-23 win over the Jacksonville Jaguars, but he also led the league with 159 yards on the ground. To put the cherry on top, he also found the end zone once on the ground. After an elite day through the air from Geno Smith, it's only right that his wide receiver 1, Jackson Smith-Njigba, led the league with 180 yards. He also found the end zone twice in the 26-20 overtime loss. On the defensive side of the ball, there was a two-way tie for the most tackles this week between Deion Henley, linebacker for the Los Angeles Chargers, and Jack Gibbons, linebacker for the Tennessee Titans. Henley was able to post a combined 14 tackles, 8 being solo and 6 being assisted in the Chargers' 27-10 win over the Browns, while Gibbons had 5 solo tackles and 9 assisted in the Titans' 20-17 win over the Patriots. MVP Power Rankings. Not too much has changed in the MVP odds this week. Once again, we'll be using BetMGM betting odds for the power rankings. 1. Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson has taken over the top spot with plus 300 odds after an incredible blowout performance against the Denver Broncos, where he posted 280 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air while only throwing 3 incompletions. To put the cherry on top, he did this against a very talented Denver Broncos defense, leading his team to a 41-10 win. 2. Josh Allen. Allen is hanging right in there in the neck-and-neck competition for the MVP, also listed at plus 300 odds. He had a very strong passing outing, going for 235 yards, 3 touchdowns and a pick, and a tight 30-27 win over the Miami Dolphins. 3. Patrick Mahomes. Following one of his best games of the year along with keeping the Kansas City Chiefs' perfect season alive, Patrick Mahomes comes in at third with plus 450 odds. He finished this Monday night showdown against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, passing for 291 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 picks in the 30-24 overtime victory. 4. Jared Goff. Continuing to hold down the 4th spot is Jared Goff, whose current odds sit at plus 700. Compared to the other 3 quarterbacks on the list, he had a very quiet game, throwing for 145 yards, 1 touchdown, and 0 picks. Despite potentially hurting his case for MVP, he still led the Detroit Lions to a 24-14 win over the Green Bay Packers. Thank you for tuning in to American Baller. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos.